and welcome back to Storytime with Alex, reading From Albion to Britannia, Book 1, The Witches of Old Albion, by the wonderful Brandy Pearson. Apologies if you can hear my landlord, who is obsessively mowing the lawn. Don't even get me started. Also, a small note that I, as promised early on in Storytime with Alex, will not be doing accents because I can't do them and it would be terrible. Today we have the tale of the wizard's boot. In the days of old Albion, in the later times when witches lived in cottages with their cats and wizards lived in towers with their books, and sometimes got on quite well with one another, there was a wizard in the south of the land of the Gales whose name was David ap Rhys. There were many wizards in the land of the Gales called David, and to tell him apart from other wizards named David, or Di for short, he was known as Di the Boot. His father was a shoemaker and had taught his son the family trade before he followed his calling as a wizard. Wizard Di the Boot lived in a tower on a headland overlooking a great bay, and would light a beacon in bad weather to warn mariners of the rocks below. He would also keep an eye out to sea for the great shoals of herring that the local fishermen relied on, and would ring a great bell to let them know they were approaching. He had his wizardly studies, but he also continued to make shoes and boots and would use his magic to improve them. As a magical experiment, he once made a pair of 7-league boots, but it was not a successful endeavour. They were impossible to control. Often the wearer of the boots would step onto or even through a roof, or end up in a tree in the great forest, or miss the land altogether and end up in the sea. His most successful boots were those he called his 1-yard boots. They were designed just to speed up the wearer a little and make a long walk easier on the feet and legs. One day he was eating bread and cheese for his lunch when he heard a knock on his oak front door. This was a little odd because whoever was there had not used his very fine door knocker in the shape of a shoe, but banged on the wood. He walked down to the entrance hall and opened the door. He looked around, but there seemed to be no one there. Muttering, he closed the door, but the knocking came again. It seemed to be very low down, as if someone were kicking the door. He opened the door again, saying, "Don't kick my door, whoever you are. Use the knocker like a civilized person." This time he looked down and saw a single left boot there on the doormat. He recognized it as one he had made himself, but as he bent down to look at it, it hopped up and down and started to hop away down the path. "Where do you think you're going?" he said. The boot stopped and returned to the doormat. "You're not supposed to walk about on your own," said the wizard. The boot hopped up and down, then set off down the path again. "I take it you want me to follow you." The boot stopped as if waiting for him. "Hold on then, let me get my own boots on." He hurriedly did as he said, put on his cloak, picked up his staff and locked the door behind him. The boot waited, then hopped away with the wizard following. Feeling a little foolish, Wizard Di the Boot followed the boot along the path, along the headland, and then along the cliff top. He looked down at the sea. The tide was coming in and would soon cover the whole beach. Anyone on the wrong part of the beach would be cut off. After a while they came to a place where the path disappeared. It had rained a lot recently and the path had crumbled away over the edge of the cliff. The boot stopped and hopped up and down at the very edge. "Don't fall over the edge," cried the wizard. He carefully looked over the edge himself and finally understood what had happened. Down on the beach lay a crumpled figure. One leg was bent awkwardly underneath her so that her right foot was hidden. Her left foot was visible, wearing a bright green sock. Even at this distance the wizard could see the person lying there was a witch, by her black and green skirt and her red coat. But he knew more than that, for now the boot was still, he recognised it as one of the pair of his best 1-yard boots that he had made for Mistress Gladys Evans, the witch who lived in a cottage in the fishing village at the other end of the bay. There was no time now to work out quite how the boot had come to fetch him, because the tide was advancing and the waves were lapping up against Mistress Evans and would soon cover her. He was not particularly skilled in floating spells, but he used what skills he had to help himself clamber down the steep cliff without falling himself. Finally he knelt in the sand next to her. He could see that she was breathing, but had been knocked out. She had a great bruise on the back of her head. He felt her cheek. She was quite cold, and now she was getting wet. From her cuts and bruises and the mud on her torn clothing, she had tumbled down the cliff when the path had given way and hit her head on a rock. Wizard Di the Boot was familiar with these cliffs and knew of a path up to the top that began further along the beach. He picked up the unconscious witch and, with a little help from his floating spell, carried her quickly along the beach as the waves lapped at his own boots. By the time he reached the bottom of the path, he was paddling through the water and was relieved to clamber up onto the path. He was quite out of breath by the time he reached the top, but could not help but smile as the boot was there waiting for them and wriggled its way back onto the witch's left foot. The wizard carried her to his tower and laid her on cushions on the settle before the fireplace in his first-floor living room. He stoked up the fire and the warmth started to revive her. In a little while she groaned and woke up. "Good day, Mistress Evans," said the wizard. "Oh, good day, Wizard Di. How did I get here?" she asked. "The last thing I remember was the cliff path giving way beneath my feet and sliding down the cliff." She felt the bump on the back of her head. "Oh, I presume I hit a rock." She tried to sit up, but let out a yell. "Oh, I think I've broken my leg. Oh my, I might have drowned if you'd not found me. How did you find me?" The wizard brought her a hot drink and she sat up. "Well, that's an interesting point," he said. "Your left boot came and fetched me." "My left boot?" "Indeed, I remember making them for you. My best 1-yard boots. There was nothing in the spell to make either of them come off your foot and find someone to rescue you. However, before we try and work out what happened, we need to patch you up, and you know much more about that kind of thing than I do." In the next hour, Wizard Di the Boot followed the instructions of Mistress Gladys Evans. He started by carefully taking off her boots. Then he cleaned up all her cuts and set her broken leg. From her bag, that was thankfully still over her shoulder when the wizard had rescued her, he brewed tea from some of her herbs and smeared ointments on her cuts and bruises, especially the big bruise on the back of her head where she had hit the rock. Then he made a bed up for her near the fire and she fell asleep. She did not wake up until the next morning. Somehow in her sleep she had worked out what must have happened. When Di the Boot came and brought her some tea and toast, she explained it to him. "As I slid down the cliff, I cried out, 'Help me, someone!' I remember that. And I was trying to grab hold of anything on the face of the cliff that might slow me down, a bush or something. That meant I was waving my arms around. My boots already had your 1-yard spell on them. So I'm fairly certain that I made an accidental spell which combined with the magic of the boots, so that when I was lying unconscious in the sand, my boots, or at least the boot that could get free, hopped off to find help." "Can you remember what you did with your arms?" said Di excitedly. "It would be a very useful spell." "That's the trouble. I've spent an hour trying to remember, but I can't." And she never did. She wore the boots until they wore out, and then the wizard repaired them, and she wore them until the wizard could fix them no more. Then she put them on a shelf with pride of place in her cottage, but they never ever moved again without her feet being in them. On the plus side, it was a fortnight before she was well enough to return to her cottage, and in that time she taught Wizard Di the Boot how to make healing herbal teas, as well as several useful healing spells, and they became very good friends. The end. Short and sweet. Join me next time. Thank you.